There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains graphic depictions of violent crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
It's the 21st of January 2010 and Vicky Rockefeller is in her house in the affluent suburb of East Malvern, roughly 8 kilometres southeast of Melbourne CBD. Her 2 children are out and she's expecting her husband Herman any minute now. Herman has been away on a business trip, a regular practice for his line of work as a property developer, and had messaged her earlier to say his flight had been delayed. Herman was good like that. He'd text her updates so she wouldn't worry while he was away, and he would always call her once he landed. But Herman hadn't called her tonight, so she waits, assuming he'd just forgotten this one time and that his blue Toyota Prius would pull into the driveway at any moment. But the minutes tick by into hours with no sign of Herman. She texts and calls, but nothing. Just after midnight, Vicky calls the police.
000, police, fire or ambulance.
Her husband's plane landed at 9:35 p.m. So the question is, where is Herman Rockefeller? I'm Gia Moylan and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Melbourne-based barrister Hilary Bonney about the disappearance of Herman Rockefeller. Her book, The Double Life of Herman Rockefeller, goes behind the scenes of the investigation to tell the story of the multi-millionaire who fell from grace. Let's start on the 21st of January 2010. Vicky Rockefeller was waiting for her husband Herman to return home from a business trip. Was this a fairly common situation for the couple?
Yes, that's what he normally did. He travelled a lot for business. On this particular trip, he'd only been up to Newcastle and he'd been buying a shopping centre up there with his brother and they were doing it up. So he'd had some meetings in Newcastle and he had to fly home from Newcastle to Brisbane, then Brisbane to Melbourne. But other times he went to Hong Kong and Singapore and New Zealand. So it wasn't unusual for him to be away for work. And what he usually did was ring Vicky and tell her when he was coming home and when he'd landed.
So when was he due home that night?
The flight was meant to land at 9:35 and it did, but he told Vicky by text that it was delayed an hour, so he lied to her.
At what point did Vicky start becoming concerned?
Well, she'd gone to the tennis, so she was distracted by watching the Australian Open in Melbourne, which is a good thing to do in summer. But when she got home, he should have been home by then. And she actually only waited about not even 3 hours before calling the police and saying, my husband's missing. So she got home from the tennis. She texted and texted him. There was no answer. She just couldn't find him. She didn't know where he was. Even if he had got in late, as he told her he was going to, he should have been home. It's only about 40 minutes from their house to the airport, and she just couldn't figure out where he was. So just a few minutes after midnight, she rang the police, the local police, and said, I think my husband's missing.
This must have been very out of character for Herman, for his wife to become concerned so quickly. What kind of guy was he? How would people describe him?
Well, he was described as a God-fearing family man, successful businessman, multi-millionaire. He's estimated to be worth about $400 million. He was a very solid citizen. He didn't have any criminal history or ostensible addictions. He was just a very well-functioning, highly successful 51-year-old man. And from Vicky's point of view, she said to the police later when they came around to her house, he's not even the type to stop on the way home to have a drink. He'd come straight home from the airport.
So he was a fairly reliable guy. What was it that he did for work?
He was a self-made businessman. He did a law degree at Melbourne Uni and then he went to Harvard Business School and did an MBA. And with his brother Robert, he set up a number of companies. There was an overall parent company that owned 2 smaller companies and each of those companies owned a shopping centre. So he was in essence a property developer, but mostly focusing on shopping centres.
And he worked from home quite a bit with this, didn't he?
He did. He shared a home office with Vicky. He'd met Vicky when he worked in New Zealand and She was a financial officer in a company he worked there. And so at home, she would help him with the business, and they'd sit side by side at desks next to each other inside their house.
So it sounds as though they had quite a strong relationship from the outside looking in.
Oh, definitely. And she thought that too. She went on the John Fane morning show and said it was a very good and solid marriage. There were no secrets, there were no dramas, there was no tension. Their daughter, their oldest child, just got into medicine, and their youngest child, they only had two, the boy was doing his last year of school, and the companies were very successful.
So when Vicky reported to police that she thought her husband was missing, where did they begin with their investigation in trying to find Herman?
Well, the first thing they did was come around to meet the family, because when someone goes missing, they look at those closest to them to see if there are any clues there about where they've gone. And the police came around the next morning very quickly, and they did what's called a missing person risk assessment. And they went through various things like addictions or money troubles, fights with other people, disputes with neighbours, risky behaviours, maybe criminal history, or whether the person's missing is a drinker or had seemed a bit depressed. And to all those questions, Vicky had answered no. There were no clues in his behaviour as to where he was or why he had disappeared.
Was there any evidence of where he might have gone? You say he was supposed to be coming back in on a flight. Do we know that he was actually on that flight?
Yes, one of the first things that the police did once it got handed to senior detectives, that detective went to the airport, because that was the last known place that Herman Rockefeller was meant to be, and went through the CCTV footage of the airport and worked with the Australian Federal Police at the airport. And they have footage of Herman walking through the corridors after getting off the plane. And then they had footage of him, his arm out the window with a white shirt, in his car, using his credit card to pay the parking at the long-term parking car park. And the timing of that was not long after the flight had landed.
In this footage, the CCTV from the airport, did he seem agitated? Did he seem like a man that could be about to go missing?
No, not at all. There was nothing unusual observed in the footage. He just walked calmly from the plane. He had in his hand a bag that had 6 grapefruits in it, and Vicky told the police later that he loved grapefruit. And so he was thinking of getting home, bringing home some treats, not very good treats, but treats from Newcastle. And his arm outside the window paid the credit card. There wasn't another person in the car. He wasn't tapping on the side of the car or fumbling or anything. It was just very calm demeanour.
So this is a man that looks quite calm on the last sighting that we have of him. He, as far as his family knows, has no business wrong dealings. He has no addictions. What were the police's initial suspicions on what might have happened to him?
Well, they always look at missing persons in 2 categories. One is people who want to go missing, and the second is people who go missing involuntarily. So people that want to go missing maybe want to leave a marriage and don't want to face up to it, or have going bankrupt and want to run away or hide from family dramas. And the police in this case quickly decided that Herman was on the second category, somebody that wouldn't voluntarily want to go missing. So they then thought, well, something's happened to him, and what could that be?
Was there any concerns in terms of his status in regards to his last name being connected to a very sort of wealthy American family, him himself being quite a wealthy businessman? Were there concerns it might have been some bad blood or a ransom situation?
Yes, that was one scenario that went through the minds of some of the police officers, because it's not your usual name. In the media, the name attracted interest, and so there was speculation that perhaps he'd been kidnapped for some of that fortune that he owned. But Vicky was quick to say to the police that although the surname was Rockefeller, and yes, Herman was American, he wasn't from the Rockefeller family. Nevertheless, he was estimated to be worth about $400 million. So that was a scenario that went through the minds of the investigators. They checked business dealings and history and talked to colleagues and acquaintances at work and talked to his brother Robert, with whom he worked. And there were no dramas, there were no skeletons in the closet of that nature.
How did the first few days after his disappearance unfold?
Well, there was a complete bafflement from the police and from Vicky and the family as to what had happened to Herman, because he didn't fit those profile of people who have dramas behind them, and maybe that's a reason why they've gone missing. So they checked the bank statements and credit card details, and his bank hadn't been used at all. And that's always a sign that somebody's not active in the world. So maybe they've had a heart attack, or they've been hit by a car and left on the side of the road, or they've been knocked out or robbed or kidnapped. And that's a very big alert sign for police. So those findings were confusing, and the police who were questioning the family and the brother, Robert, they came up with more questions than answers initially. So it was decided then to go to the media and see if anyone had found or seen Herman's car.
So this is about 72 hours after he went missing. The Vicky's interviewed on radio on the John Fane morning show. Was that successful? Did it give police any leads in the investigation?
It was successful because the car that Herman had was a Toyota Prius, and it was light blue and it was in good condition. And 12 years ago, they weren't so common, and it was spotted by somebody, a truck driver, up out of Melbourne near Ballan, the Ballan-Dalesford Road, on the side of the road just left. And that was a big clue. The police went straight to the car and took it back to the forensic laboratory and ran tests on it and looked particularly at the GPS system, and that gave them a big clue.
Now, while that is all unfolding, another call came through after the radio interview. What did we find out from Liza's call?
Well, her call came out of the blue to the police station, and throughout that call, after the police hung up, the idea that they had of what Herman Rockefeller was dramatically changed, because what Liza said was that she was Herman Rockefeller's girlfriend before they were both married to Herman, to Vicky, and Liza to her husband. They'd gone out for 3 years, and Vicky knew that. But what Vicky didn't know, and the police didn't know, was that they'd rekindled their relationship and they'd been on and off for 27 years. So Liza was in effect his mistress, and she rang the police with some information that, as I said, greatly changed the character of Herman Rockefeller in the mind of the investigators.
Well, this is a man who, by all accounts, is a family man, a churchgoer. The two things seem to be quite at odds here. She happened to mention that he had multiple phones as well.
That's right, and that was a shock both to the police, because before Liza made the call to the police, she called Vicky, and that phone call was full of surprises for Vicky. Firstly, the woman ringing up saying, "I've been in a relationship with your husband for 27 years. We didn't actually just break up and that was it." And secondly, he's got lots of phone numbers and mobile phones.
Now, with this new revelation, police went back over what they thought they knew about Herman and the evidence that they had so far gathered. And they decided to do a more thorough search of the family house. What did they find?
Well, they found 19 photographs and a CD of the photographs in the locked filing cabinet in Herman's office, which was the office he shared with Vicky. And in my book about Herman Rockefeller, I call it the chapter, "These are not family snaps," because they certainly weren't. They were photos of Herman and a woman in various sexual positions, both naked, looking at the camera. And this was another massive shock to the police and to Vicky Rockefeller, that he had these photos in his possession. And tucked in the envelope of the photos was a ripped out ad from what was known as a sex paper. It was a paper that was published. It doesn't happen now. It probably happens online now. And it was seeking swingers in Melbourne.
Those pieces of evidence obviously gave police a lot to work off in terms of changing their perspective about who Herman was and what he might have been up to. But what was the significance of the newspaper clipping specifically?
Well, what happened was the police, at the same time they're looking through the car, and in the Prius is a newspaper that Herman had on the day he went missing. And on the side of the newspaper is an address written, South Street, Hadfield. And they also found on his GPS of his car that address. So there's those two clues, and then there's a piece of newspaper referring to swingers clubs and parties. There's various organisations with great names like Brizzy Bangers and Wet on Wellington. And the police are starting to get a pretty clear picture that Herman Rockefeller's not the God-fearing family man that they thought he was.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gia Moylan. I'm speaking with author Hilary Bonney about the disappearance of Herman Rockefeller. So this has obviously blown the case wide open. What were the next steps for police? They have the knowledge that he is doing a few things that we weren't aware of and that his family weren't aware of, and we have this address. Where do they go from there?
Well, there's a few police members working on it. So they go and they set up a surveillance unit outside South Street, Hadfield, to see if there's any clue there. And they go there and they see the man that lives there, with Mario Shembri, and a woman who lives there called Bernadette Denny, coming in and out and going about their various activities. And the suburb is far away from East Malvern in terms of class, architecture, aesthetics, income potential of its inhabitants as you could get, the opposite end of the spectrum. The downtrodden, ugly, bleak little suburb with a high unemployment rate and a low socioeconomic population. So the police are alerted to the fact that Herman Rockefeller must have gone to this house, and that's probably the last place he was before he disappeared.
What do we know about the couple? Do we have much context as to their life leading up to when Herman was potentially in their home?
Yes. If I start with Mario first, he's Maltese, he's very short, he's very stocky, he's bald. He's the same age as Herman Rockefeller, but at worse physical shape. He's a rubbish remover. He tells the police later on that his main achievement in life is that he can clean shit up. He tinkers with cars. He removes hard rubbish when people call him, which isn't very often. He has bombing cars for sale. He's a father. He's got 8 children. He's got one little girl that died when she was 16 months of age. He's 6 grandchildren. And he's been going out with Bernadette Denny for 10 months at the time that Herman Rockefeller disappears. Now, Bernadette was equally as downtrodden and sad in my view. She's a child of Catholic Italian and Egyptian parents who also migrated to Australia. She had a severely disabled brother who was put in an institution. She was sexually abused when she was 10 to 14. She told her mum about it, and the mother said, "This happens to all girls, never speak of it again." And this affected Bernadette in a terrible way. She left school at 16. She tried to do year 9 twice, but couldn't. To 20, she had a serious car accident and a lot of bones in her body, and that led to a lot of drinking. She became an alcoholic. She started putting on weight. She met a man called Robert Bristler, and she had 2 girls with him. And Robert's a big dope smoker and a very angry man. And he died of bone cancer when he was 41. And Bernadette was left at 29 with 2 little girls under 4. No real skills, a bad drinking problem, and depression, arthritis, overweight. She spends the next 10 years drinking hard liquor. She balloons out to over 100 kilos. And the Department of Human Services, as it was called then, take her girls off her and place them in the care of her parents. So when Herman Rockefeller went missing, Bernadette and Mario are living in the unit in South Street, Hadfield, and they'd been living together since April the year before. And Bernadette was at a very low point in her life. She'd had a lot of rehabilitation for alcoholism that didn't work, but she was hoping that the new year, 2010, was going to turn things around.
So how did Herman come to know Bernadette and Mario? Why was he at their house?
Well, the answer to that lies in some ads that Herman had placed in these sex papers. And he'd done it, the police found, for 10 years. He'd done it over 2 publications, roughly 1 a month. And these ads started off using a fake name of Herman Rockwell. They ended up with him using other fake names, including the name of Andy Kingston. And Bernadette and Mario, that only lived together for 10 months, were interested in having a threesome and having sex with a stranger. So they also had these sex papers and found the ad for Andy Kingston. He described himself as very attractive, ex-model, ex-television personality, said he had a very large penis, and Bernadette made a call to him, and he'd been to their house in Hadfield before the night he went missing.
So the circumstantial evidence is adding up against the couple. Where did the investigation go from there?
Well, they arrest first Mario and then Bernadette and take them to the police station in St Kilda Road. By this time, the homicide squad is part of the investigation, and some very experienced detectives from that squad interviewed both Mario and Bernadette in separate rooms, of course, and asked them about the visit that Herman Rockefeller has paid to their house and where he is now.
They both had different approaches in their interviews with police. Bernadette was fairly forthcoming right out the gate, wasn't she?
Yes, the first thing she says is, I'm stuffed. But she then lies to them and says that she'd never met Andy Kingston, as she knew Herman Rockefeller to be, but that he'd been pestering her for sex, ringing up on the ad and keep harping on about coming over, having some fun with Bernadette and Mario. Then she says that, he had come over. There'd been a fight because he'd come without his sex partner or his wife, so he didn't bring a woman, came on his own, and he wanted to have sex with Bernadette again because he'd already been there and done that the year before. And so that led to a fight. Bernadette said that it made her feel dirty. It made Mario angry. It made them feel cheated because the deal was that he'd bring a woman and there'd be sex with both partners, all of them together, and Andy Kingston wasn't following the deal. So she said that things got ugly and there was a fight, and next thing Andy, as she knew him, was lying in the garage but still breathing and still alive, injured after the fight but not dead.
So by her account, he was still alive, but what did she say had then happened, that he'd just gotten up and left their house? How did she account for him actually departing their home?
Well, that's a good question, and what it revealed, the answer that I'm going to tell you, reveals that Bernadette, although she was down and out and pressured and stressed and thought that she was completely stuffed, to use her word in the police interview room, she still had a little bit of rat cunning left in her. And she said they put him in the boot of the car and they drove him up north somewhere near Heathcote Way, a small winemaking area about an hour and a half, 2 hours from where they lived. And that while they were driving, he was tapping on the boot, and they got up there and left him there. And the detectives who were interviewing her go on a road trip to try and find, if they can, the body of Herman Rockefeller, perhaps an injured Herman Rockefeller by the side of the road. But at this stage, it's about 6 days since he's been missing. So there's a very faint chance that he might be alive. One important thing was that Herman was very, very fit. He ran marathons. He took very particular and fastidious care of his health. So he was fitter than your average 51-year-old man. And there might have been a chance that if he was just injured or somewhere without his phone in the middle of nowhere, that he was lying in the bush, and perhaps this story could have a happy ending.
But unfortunately, while they are starting to conduct this search, Mario, who had previously been quite tight-lipped with police, he did eventually come up with his side of the story. Did it line up with what Bernadette had to say?
No, it was the complete opposite. Mario was bargaining with the police. He wanted to see his family, he said, and then he'd talk to the police. And he wasn't very articulate. He was a very frustrating interviewee. But he kept saying things like, it just happened. I went blank and it just got out of hand. And throughout his mumblings and his grumblings, the police got the sense there was a fight, that there was some deal or arrangement that had fallen down, and that Mario thought that Herman Rockefeller had taken both Mario and Bernadette for fools and was trying to take advantage of them. There was a fight, and then Herman was hurt in the fight and was killed.
And there was some evidence in their unit to corroborate the stories. A spatter of Herman's blood in the garage, I believe. Did Bernadette or Mario have any kind of criminal history? Or did it just seem like these two were just two people that had gotten carried away in a terrible moment?
Well, that's a really good question. That's sort of the nub of what the police were trying to wrestle with at this stage. Because at this stage, they don't have a body. And bodies will tell police and forensic examiners what happened. So there might be like handprint marks on the neck or a bruise or a cut on the throat. But there's no body. They're just relying on the person that's inflicted the injury to get that version of events. And Mario could barely articulate what happened. He just said there was fighting and then he hit his head and that was it. So that they didn't really know whether this was a highly planned attack, if it was self-defense, if it was spur of the moment. They didn't know if there was a criminal plan to get Herman there and perhaps hurt him and get his money. They weren't clear. So what they did was look at the history of Mario, and Mario had 2 criminal convictions in the past, but one was insignificant and one was a serious assault, which was more significant to the police. But there was 20 years since that had happened. So he wasn't on the police record as a violent man consistently, but he was somebody who perhaps had a spark of anger in him that had lain dormant for 20 years and had sparked again with Herman and whatever Herman did or didn't do. And as Bernadette, she had no criminal history.
Bringing it back to Herman's blue Prius, because that was critical evidence for police, how did it end up in Belen?
Well, the car was found so far away that it was either driven by Herman or driven by Mario and Bernadette. And given that they'd found out then that Herman had died in the garage, it was clear that was Bernadette and Mario had driven the car up to the countryside. And in fact, they then started knocking on doors around the house, around the unit in Hadfield, and there was a couple who'd been sitting out the front and watched the whole scene play out of Mario trying to get this expensive hybrid car onto his old truck and load it up, and he's having a fight with Bernadette while he was doing that, and then leave the area, leave the street while this couple are watching his clapped out old truck and head in the direction of where the truck was found. So it didn't take long to figure out that Mario had got rid of the car.
So it's clear he's gotten rid of the car, but where's the body?
Well, Mario had taken a lot of junk and a lot of rubbish, bits of cars and things like that, round to a friend of his house around the corner from where Bernadette and he lived. And the person that owned that house was called Jack, and Jack had intellectual disability and was happy to see Mario, even though he bought a lot of crap, put it around his backyard. And Mario told the police that he went round there with Herman and got rid of him. And what became apparent was that Mario and Bernadette had gone to Bunnings and they bought a $99 chainsaw and had taken it back to the garage. And then Mario had gone in and chopped off the limbs of the body and the head while Bernadette was inside the unit, obviously very upset. And he'd taken those pieces then around to Jack's house and burnt them in the incinerator in the backyard.
And police were able to find evidence in this backyard, as well as in Mario's truck, to corroborate this version of events. What did they eventually charge the couple with?
Well, firstly, they were charged with murder because there's a presumption that the victim, in this case Herman, had gone to the house alive, was killed, and they charged them with the sort of top offence. But to prove murder, you've got to have a guilty intent and a guilty actions. And the guilty intent in law is to have the intention to kill or to cause really serious injury. And they're worried that they didn't have enough proof of what was in the mind of Bernadette and Mario at the time that they killed Herman Rockefeller. So the defence seized upon this and offered a plea offer, which was accepted by the Director of Public Prosecutions, which was a plea from each of them to manslaughter, which is a lesser offence than murder.
What did they ultimately get sentenced to?
Well, they pleaded guilty to manslaughter, as I said, and they have a plea hearing, and in that all that information about their sad lives came out, some of which I've told you today, and Justice Forrest of the Supreme Court sentenced them differently. He sentenced Mario to 9 years with a minimum of 7 years to serve, and he sentenced Bernadette to 7 years with a 5-year minimum to serve.
So this case, both at the time and in future years, has garnered a lot of attention. Why do you think it remains so fascinating for bystanders?
Well, I think that at the heart of this story is a question, which is one that Mario said pretty accurately. He said about Herman, he had all the money in the world. He could have hired a hooker. He could have bought a whole whorehouse rather than see us. What was his problem? And I think that question is the heart of the fascination with this story, is why would someone that had everything go to the wrong side of town with frankly not very attractive people, both inside and out, and have sex with them and end up dead. So I think it's that fall from grace. I think that the public fascinated by people that seemingly have everything but have a double life, or in Herman Rockefeller's case, really had a triple life. And it's a terrible phrase, but looking behind the mansion walls, how the people that are high up in society come down. There's a great degree of schadenfreude in relation to this, I'm sorry to say.
In your research, while writing your book about this case, you interviewed some forensic psychologists and psychiatrists that specialise in relationships to try to sort of understand Herman's motivations for this double life. What light did they shed on it?
The first thing I found out was that a swinger is not what Herman Rockefeller was. I spoke to a professor of sociology in America, Dr. Bergstrand, and he said swingers are people that try and enhance the emotional and sexual relationship with their partner by a consensual participation in sex with strangers with the partner for recreational sex. So Dr. Bergstrand said that, these people have rules. There's swingers events, there's rules, there's ways of reciprocating sexual partners, and there's a code that they stick to, and there's some honesty is the main thing, honesty with your spouse. So it's a joint, I suppose, marital exploit. So in his view, Herman Rockefeller wasn't a swinger, he was just a cheater. And I spoke to the man, is sort of like the union rep of swingers in Melbourne, and he said, I don't think that Herman Rockefeller's a swinger either. He said real swingers wouldn't know people like Herman because they, again, have rules, they have a code, they have swingers parties, there's an etiquette and an honesty about having sex with other people with your marital partner or your long-term partner. So it's more of a lifestyle thing. It's not sort of a double life. I then spoke to an expert in sex addiction, Dr. Janet Hall, and she said she knows the type, Herman Rockefeller's type, well. She didn't treat him, but she's treated a lot of men like him. And they're extremely successful in finance and business. They have happy families. They have a very strong IQ and they're high up in society, but they get sick of being tightly controlled and being so obligated. And so they look for sex, like a rush of excitement, a bit of dirtiness and a bit of a thrill to release from that side of their life. And that's, she says, that they're sex addicts because they've got no more challenges left in their legitimate lives. They want to break out sort of their class almost to go and have an idea of sex with strangers, like a conquest, like a hunt. And she says some of Herman Rockefeller's behaviour was like that. And so there would be no rational explanation or ability to talk him out of driving to Bernadette's house that night, even though he had a wife who was going to be home waiting for him. The seeking of sex and the hunting of it down becomes such an addiction that everything's revolved around trying to have time to do that, to have those sexual liaisons around a busy schedule. And she said they're often rich men because having money gives these men privacy and it gives them time. They don't have a boss that's watching them. They have travel for business, they have second houses, holiday houses, and they have time. So they can be away from home and no one's suspecting anything. So in her view, sex addiction was the basis of Herman's behaviour. And I tend to agree with her. And I think then if you look at that, it doesn't matter who the sexual partner is. And in this case, the attraction of Bernadette and Mario was that they were not known. They weren't going to run into Herman in his side of town. They weren't going to run into him at school or through business or even at the church. They were in another planet, really. Hadfield, a class away from the streets where Herman Rockefeller lived, and he would not be known there. He could go there as Andy Kingston, and he could be, as rude and rough and dirty and quick and demanding as he liked. So it wasn't almost like it was Herman. It was like his alter ego. And that to me made sense.
Hilary Bonney is a Melbourne-based barrister with extensive experience in criminal law. She's written a number of true crime books, including The Double Life of Herman Rockefeller, which you can find a link to in our show description. This episode of True Crime Conversations was hosted and produced by myself, Gia Moylan, with sound design by Rhiannon Mooney. If you'd like to discuss today's episode with other true crime fans, don't forget to join our True Crime Conversations group on Facebook. Or if you have a suggestion for a case you think we should cover next, get in touch with us at truecrime@mamamia.com.au.